So you
Yeah,
don't like the suffering, and you don't like
I
the
don't like the
emphasis,
suffering.
and you don't like the emphasis on the inversion of the social order. You don't like the proselytism,
Yeah.
right?
I think there's two aspects of Christianity that I find somewhat objectionable. One is
Huh?
the obsessiveness of the victimhood, which in some sense transcends much of the moral thinking around law and order. There's, in Judaism, there's 613 mitzvot, which are considered sort of the sacraments that are described. And two of them that actually co-appear. One is do not show any favor to a wealthy man at trial, and also do not show any favor to the poor man at trial either. Right? The thought of judgment and law and order is absolute in the Jewish case. In other words, provide fairness to all, but that means scrupulous fairness to all. The other thing that I think is unique about Judaism that is an extension of Christianity, that is an extension of Judaism, is the millenarian messianic vibe to it. I mean, it was originally a messianic cult of Judaism, right? And there, you said something very interesting in what you said, right? Which is where you think Christianity maybe goes astray, isn't that the kingdom of God must be realized on earth rather than in the afterlife, which is a sort of shift that's happened throughout Christianity's history. In early Christianity, the early Christians thought it was happening in their lifetimes. Of course, it didn't, and that got kind of pushed back. The bill on utopia is somewhat easier to pay when it's in the afterlife than when it's on this earth. But I think if you look at world history in the 18th and 19th century, when God died, as described by Nietzsche, that's when you started seeing a lot of these millenarian projects that eventually became the social progressive movement around abolitionism, suffragism, Marxism, even ethno-nationalism as we know it today. A lot of these movements to perfect reality came out of a time when God sort of died, but that religious urge was still there.
Yes.
And the last comment on that is one big, again, I'm approaching it now from the Jewish perspective. One big difference between Christianity and Judaism is that Christianity is very otherworldly, right? It speaks of some state of perfection, whether it be a future world where there's racism has been banished, or the future kingdom of God, or whatever. But it's always trying to balance an ugly reality to some idealized state of holy perfection. And I think Judaism is very different. It's very worldly. It doesn't speak in terms of perfections. It speaks of your practice in the here and now. The afterlife is almost talked about not at all. And there's a very easy mixing between, the animal spirits of greed, militarism, violence, business. All that gets commented on by the sages. All of it, literally, in the most sordid detail. It all gets discussed in the most open way, in a way that you just could not imagine in the Christian world.
But the notion that we should effect utopia on earth, which I agree with you, it has its roots in Christian millenarianism and Christian eschatology, the notion that we are leading to the second coming of Jesus. However, there's also deep within Christianity, let me push back a little bit, and this is true in Augustine more than sort of anywhere else, that the very fact that we are broken means that our ability ourselves to construct that utopia is fundamentally flawed. And you see this in a work like Thomas More's Utopia in the early 16th century. You see the notion of our brokenness being a way in which politics cannot actually transform the world. Only faith can, only the intervention of the divine can. And that will also be always compromised by the fact that we are fallen, that we are incapable of being the creatures we are destined to be and are on our mode of being. Now, so I agree with you, absolutely, that some elements of Christianity were taken on, especially the eschatology, especially this proselytism, especially the need to enforce it on others as a way to save their souls, not just their bodies and minds. I agree with you. But I'm not so sure that Christianity hasn't at some point resisted that formally, has actually opposed that formally. I mean, Christianity was a key part of the resistance to communism and was in some parts, not in all, to our eternal shame, but in some parts to fascism. So presumably you think Christianity has some role to play still in the West, or do you think it's lost?
Oh, yeah. And to be clear, I mean, obviously that mentality of perfecting the world has been an enormous success in many ways, right? If you look at our current notion of human rights, I mean, as often starry-eyed and unrealistic as it is, the UN Human Rights Charter, I think, is this momentous document to think that everyone on the earth should have these. I think it's a little naive too sometimes, but that I think is obviously the fruit of centuries of Christian civilization. And so, yeah, no, look, it's hard to ding Christianity when I'm living in a Christian, we're all living in a Christian world, and we're no longer living in some barbaric pagan world with human sacrifices.
As the point you often make, we're living in a Christian world that somehow doesn't have faith in God, which is a particularly weird space to be in.